Welcome to Water in Washington Square Park. I am your host, Julie, and today I'm going to be showing you how to recognize the sacredness of water, as well as teach some history about this land. This tour is meant to explain how water is sacred as understood by Indigenous people for centuries. Indigenous activists have been telling Westerners that they've lost their spiritual connection to the earth, and this tour is an attempt at explaining to a Western audience the importance of our earth through water. As I tell the story of this land, you will find that this loss of spiritual connection is closely linked to the injustices suffered by Native Americans. The erasure of Indigenous people from our history still holds significance today, and I will discuss more of this later. But for the time being, I would like to ask you, do you know whose land we are on? If you don't, stay tuned as I will tell you. But meditate on why you may not know and the privileges you experience from being on this land. Please take this tour at your own pace, as I intend you, the listener, to meditate on each place we stop at. As you stand in front of Washington Square Fountain, please admire the beautiful display of water. To many Indigenous people, running water symbolizes the continuity of life. For thousands of years, Native American tribes across the Great Plains developed their own methods of living with the natural world and this limited water supply. Water symbolizes many things, including life and death, strength, change, healing, dreaming, and unconditional love. Depending on the condition and clearness, water could also represent both good and bad health. You do not need to be religious to have a spiritual connection to the earth, and I encourage you now to touch the water if you can. Feel it drip from your hand. Note its condition and clearness. Likely, this water comes from the Delaware and Catskill system, where it has traveled approximately a 125-mile journey to be in your hands. Water is a cycle, and water in this fountain has previously evaporated into the sky, where it has fallen right back down, participating in the cycle for thousands of years now. Water is vital to all living beings, and the more people recognize it as life, the more we may cherish it. Now that you have taken awareness of this water, consider the many people on reservations that do not have access to clean water. Unfortunately, this injustice is not recent and is connected to a history of colonization. This land has been colonized, and the evidence is all around you. Much of New York City was occupied by the Lenape, and this area of the city was specifically occupied by Munsee Lenape, with the community of Spakonaiken living closest to the square. The Munsee Lenape currently live in Ontario, Canada, and were forced out of their land by colonizer. This park sits on stolen land. Please recognize the privileges associated with this. The water that flows from this fountain may symbolize the continuity of life, but for this fountain to reside here, it came at the cost of many Indigenous lives. Sit by the water and appreciate its sacredness, but also recognize your privileges in doing so. Now that you have felt the water in the fountain, please take this time to actually drink the water if you so please. Remind yourself of the beauty in the simplest act of drinking, how this essential, yet not always accessible element flows through you and every other organism. You are connected to every living being through water. Identify what water signifies for you and the importance it holds in your life. While you consider this, listen to the history of this land and how water connects it to you. A natural water channel known as the Minetta Creek used to run through part of the square. It has long been buried, but it used to be life for white-footed mice and beavers, as well as snapping turtles and wood ducks. The red-backed salamander and bullfrog used to live near the water, while the American eel and brown bullhead used to swim up the creek. Picture the surrounding area filled with vegetation such as the red maple and winter squash pumpkin. The Lenape people likely hunted wild turkeys and various turtles while gathering American chestnuts and stiff dogweeds. The natural environment of Mannahatta was so rich because of its biodiversity. But do not be mistaken, this park still has various plants and animal species even today. The tree that stands in front of the drinking fountain you are at is known as a katsura. House sparrows, American robins, and rock pigeons are likely spotted near or on its branches. There are also American sycamores, deodar cedars, and many more tree species around the park. Unfortunately, this land was not always vibrating with plant and animal species. As you walk to our next stop, consider how water connects you to the history of the geography of this land, as well as all the living organisms around you. Take a moment to admire this beautiful tree that is in front of you. Sit by it if you desire. Feel its bark. Hug the tree if you feel compelled to. If there are any of its leaves or branches on the ground, feel free to pick them up and hold them. Notice any animals or insects that may be on or around the tree. During or after this recording, feel free to meditate near this tree because it holds a lot of history. The Lenape people knew this area as marshy ground with a flowing creek where many plant and animal species would flock to until the 1600s when colonizers began to come to the island of Mannahatta and push out the various tribes that were here and drastically transform the land. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company established a trading post at the tip of the island, which meant a growing population with a growing number of farmers and plots being laid out. This area used to be agricultural land for African-born, formerly enslaved people, in which they were required to give a portion of their crops to English settlers. Eventually, this land was taken from black farmers by the colonizers and remained farmland until 1797, when it became a potter's field, or a burial place for the poor and marginalized, which included indigenous people. There are roughly 20,000 corpses still buried in the soil this park sits upon. This tree has been rumored to have hung traitors of the American Revolution and is more than 300 years old. After epidemics filled the burial site, the New York's Common Council decided to turn the land into a drilling ground for the city's volunteer militia companies in 1826. Then, in 1870, the parade ground was transformed into the park we know today, with the exception of a few additions, such as the fountain and the arch added later. Nowhere in this park will you find a public display of how colonization robbed this land of the Lenape. No evidence of the once marshy ground that used to be present, or the disrespectful burial of the bodies that currently lie here. One of the only things present is the Hangman's Elm, one of the oldest trees in Manhattan currently. Contemplate the erasure of history as well as the transformation this land has endured. To be in tune with our spiritual connection to this earth, we should contemplate what has happened to the land up until this point. Perhaps understanding the history of this place may help you feel closer to its natural environment. Before you walk to the next stop, meditate by this tree and its history. After listening to the history of this land and appreciating the moments where you may have felt a spiritual connection to the water and nature, I would ask you to turn your attention to the arch and all that stands around it. This arch commemorates George Washington and was meant to be a temporary installation. The arch was so well received that it was commissioned for a permanent installation soon after its reveal. Consider who is celebrated in this park and who has been forgotten. This park is home to many plant and animal species, but many people are unaware of which are native to New York and which aren't. While the fountain may be a beautiful display, it requires 32,000 gallons of water to be filtered. I'm not encouraging a dismantlement of this fountain, nor a complete remodel of the park. Rather, I encourage you to ponder the comforts and privileges associated with this park. When we can so easily have water be filtered for our fountains, why are there indigenous people and other marginalized groups living without water? When we have our green spaces for leisure and recreation, why can we not conserve and preserve our wildlife? When we choose to install monuments, why can we not honor the true history of this land and recognize the atrocities of colonization? These are the questions I encourage you to ponder when you are in moments of appreciating your natural environment. They are meant to be uncomfortable, but push for action and advocacy. I encourage you to continue exploring the park, and I hope you have enjoyed this tour. Thank you for your time.